Before the world knew his name, a small boy walked the dusty streets of Mecca and learned to listen to the wind, a listening that would grow into a message that changed history. From which country are you watching this video? Subscribe to this channel if you love Islam. He was born around 570 CE into the Quraysh, a tribe at the heart of Arabia's trade routes, and from the very start life taught him loss and responsibility. His father, Abdullah, died before he was born, and his mother, Amina, passed away when he was about 6. So the child who would become the prophet grew up an orphan, raised first by his grandfather Abdul Muttalib and later by his uncle Abu Talib, learning early what it means to depend on community while carrying a quiet dignity within himself. Those early years as a child shepherd were more than chores and grazing flocks. They were long, solitary hours that sharpened patience, taught him to read the sky, and gave him time to reflect in a landscape of stones and stars, a practice of inwardness that would later find expression in the Cave of Hira. Even as a youth he stood out, not because he sought attention, but because people noticed his calm, honest in trade, steady in speech. He earned the name Al-Amin, the trustworthy, a reputation rare in any market, and a reputation that would give his later words weight among those who knew him before the revelations began. Working on caravans exposed him to a broader world than Mecca's stones. He saw distant ports, met travelers and traders, and learned how justice and fairness in business can bind communities together. These journeys shaped his sense that ethics matter in ordinary life, and that spiritual truths must be lived, not just spoken. When Khadija, a successful and respected merchant, proposed marriage, it was not merely a union of two people, but a partnership that steadied him. She was older, wealthy, and deeply supportive, and their household became a refuge, where faith and compassion grew quietly and powerfully, producing children and a domestic life that was plain, loving, and morally serious. Through these years of family, work, and reflection, he was known for modest living, simple bedding, generous alms, and a refusal of ostentation habits that taught those around him that greatness could be silent and that leadership often begins with humility. In the solitude of the Cave of Hira, he retreated from the noise of the markets and the politics of Mecca to sit with his thoughts, fasting, praying, and searching for meaning in a world where many gods were worshipped, but one still felt right to his heart. Those retreats were not escapes, but training grounds for a mission he did not yet fully understand. At about 40 years old, during one of these retreats, the extraordinary began. The angel Gabriel brought the first revelation, commanding him to read or recite, and with that single moment, the private life of a reflective merchant became the public life of a prophet, a bearer of a message that would call people to pure monotheism, moral reform, and care for the weak. The shock of the encounter was profound. He returned home trembling, unsure, overwhelmed. But Khadija's immediate faith and comfort grounded him. She wrapped him in reassurance, sought counsel from her Christian cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, and became his first and most steadfast believer, providing the emotional and practical shelter that every emerging leader needs. Revelation did not arrive as a torrent all at once, but as a continuous, often intimate process. Verses came in response to situations, questions, and crises, and their gradual unfolding meant that the early message always spoke directly to the lived realities of those first listeners, addressing social injustice, spiritual confusion, and the urgent need for compassion. The earliest converts were not elites alone, but people from varied backgrounds. Abu Bakr, a close friend and successful merchant, accepted quickly and used his influence to protect others. Ali ibn Abi Talib, still a youth, showed devotion and courage. Ordinary men and women, freed slaves, and those at society's margins found in this message something that restored dignity and offered hope. because the new teaching threatened Mecca's established social and economic order, which centered on idol worship, tied to pilgrimage profits and tribal prestige. Elite opposition grew sharp, mixing ridicule with fierce attempts to silence the new community. Yet persecution did not simply crush the movement, it refined it, revealing the depth of conviction among followers who chose belief despite social cost. The Prophet's approach in those early Meccan years was patient and moral rather than political or coercive. He counseled quietly, used parables and moral example, and invited people to change through persuasion and character, not force, which is why his personal behavior, truthfulness, gentleness, unwillingness to retaliate, mattered so much as a living sermon. Small cells of believers met in secret or in trusted households, memorizing revelations, supporting one another, and learning to live a life that refused the cruelties of their time, caring for orphans, feeding the poor, treating women with dignity, and refusing exploitative economic practices like usury. These practices made the faith tangible, not theoretical, and drew people who wanted concrete justice as well as spiritual truth. Persecution pushed some followers to seek refuge elsewhere, and a group was allowed to immigrate to Abyssinia under a Christian king who recognized justice and granted them protection. An early moment of interfaith respect that also revealed the Prophet's strategic care for his community's survival. Back in Mecca, the social boycott and increasing hostility forced his supporters into tighter bonds and creative forms of resistance. They performed acts of charity quietly. They preserved texts and oral transmissions of the revelations, and they practiced patience as a theological virtue as much as a social necessity. Throughout this time, he continued to call people toward the essentials: belief in one God, ethical conduct, accountability in the afterlife, while insisting that spiritual depth must show itself in everyday actions. Kindness to neighbors, fairness in trade, and steadfastness in adversity. This insistence on lived faith won respect and, over years, created a community whose roots were moral conviction as much as doctrinal assent. Even when opposition sharpened and personal danger increased, he rarely answered with vengeance. Instead, he sought allies, appealed to shared human values, and modeled a patient resilience that would become a hallmark of his prophetic character, preparing both him and his followers for the larger struggles that lay ahead. These formative decades, orphanhood and trust, quiet industry and trade, the sanctuary of marriage, nights of solitude in Hira, the thunderbolt of first revelation, and the slow gathering of a devoted but persecuted community, are not just biography, but a blueprint for how conviction, humility, and persistent moral action can reshape a society from its roots outward. The faith he was entrusted with was born in silence, tested in hardship, and nurtured through relationships of love and loyalty that made a seemingly impossible mission possible. As you listen, think about the small acts that shape a life: a promise kept in the marketplace, a moment of compassion to a neighbor, an hour of quiet prayer. These were the same forces that forged a prophet and a movement, and they remind us that extraordinary change often begins in ordinary places. When the pressure in Mecca tightened and mockery turned into violence, the fledgling community found itself forced to think beyond private faith and into the dangerous work of survival and solidarity. Some were quietly exhorted to seek asylum across the sea in Abyssinia, where a Christian king known for justice received them with surprising generosity, and that exile became a living lesson that faith can find refuge in unexpected friendships, and that religious difference need not mean enmity. Back in Mecca, the campaign against the Prophet's supporters grew systematic. Economic boycotts, social ostracism, and public humiliation were used to weaken the bonds that kept the community together. And yet these hardships produced an inward sharpening, a discipline of patience, mutual aid, and creativity that bound believers by more than doctrine, by acts of care and by a shared sense of purpose. Small households became schools of resilience. Families hid converts, shared scarce food, and passed revelations to one another by heart at night. And those secret circles were the seedbeds of a movement that refused to disintegrate when public life turned hostile. In the midst of this pressure, there were flashes of moral courage that still inspire. When a weak widow or a slave embraced the new faith and paid the price in life or livelihood, companions stepped forward with quiet acts, feeding, sheltering, arguing on their behalf, and those acts of courage taught the community that the work of faith is measured as much by what it protects as by what it proclaims. As hostilities increased, the Prophet and his followers sought allies beyond Mecca's limits, and 2 pledges at Al-Aqaba, solemn covenants made with people from Yathrib, opened a new horizon. Men and women from that town promised protection and support in return for guidance, and those accords planted the possibility of a safe haven where the community could exist openly and build institutions instead of surviving in secrecy. That migration, the Hijra, was not a single event, but a chain of careful movements, negotiations, and sacrifices. Many left family and property behind, trusting that a new social order could be built on spiritual conviction and mutual obligation, and the journey itself became a test of faith that separated rhetoric from real commitment. The planning for migration was marked by prudence and solidarity. Some left in small groups to avoid detection, while others stayed to divert attention, and a few brave souls, including close companions, sheltered the Prophet and hid him when the threat of assassination became acute. Their courage in those moments shows how spiritual leadership often depends on the bravery of ordinary people willing to risk everything for a shared cause. When the Prophet arrived in Yathrib, he found a society fractured by clan rivalry and intertribal revenge, yet ready for a new model of civic life. Instead of imposing religious uniformity, he crafted a social compact, the Constitution of Medina, that bound diverse groups into a single political body while preserving religious differences, recognizing Jewish tribes as part of the polity with mutual obligations and establishing common rules for defense, dispute resolution, and protection of the vulnerable. This constitution was remarkable for its time because it treated religion and citizenship as related but not identical. People could keep their beliefs and still be full members of a civic community committed to justice and common welfare, and the document's clauses on mutual aid and protection set a precedent for a pluralistic public order rooted in obligation rather than domination. The Prophet's new mosque in Medina became the literal and metaphorical center of this civic life, not just a place of prayer, but a courthouse, school, hospital, and an assembly hall where disputes were mediated. Children learned to read the revelations, and citizens organized relief for the poor. The mosque's multifunctional role embodied the idea that worship and public responsibility are inseparable. Integration into Medina required more than legal texts. It demanded social inventions to bind migrants, muhajirun, and local supporters, ansar, into real households of trust. So the community practiced systems of support, sharing of property, hospitality, and adoption-like arrangements that turned strangers into kin and made social welfare a lived reality rather than an abstract obligation. Alongside community building, the new polity had to face immediate threats. Meccan hostility did not fade with distance, and alliances of hostile tribes formed to challenge the Muslims' existence, setting the stage for a series of confrontations that would test whether the moral and institutional experiments of Medina could survive the furnace of war. The Prophet's response to these threats combined ethical restraint with strategic clarity. He rejected wanton violence, insisted on protecting non-combatants and places of worship when possible, and used both diplomacy and military preparedness to defend the community's right to live and practice its faith. These choices show that early Islamic leadership balanced principle and prudence rather than simply swinging between pacifism and conquest. The Battle of Badr stands out as the community's first decisive test. A small, disciplined force met a larger Meccan army near a well, and the clash became legendary not only for its military outcome, but for what it revealed about morale, equality, and the role of conviction in history. Victory at Badr was read by believers as a sign that moral resolve and trust in God can overturn material disadvantages. But it also taught hard lessons about responsibility, treatment of prisoners, and the perils of hubris when triumph comes. After Badr, the question of how to treat captives became urgent. The Prophet chose options that combined justice with mercy, ransom, exchange, and at times teaching literacy and skills in return for freedom, decisions that turned enemies into sources of reconciliation and that emphasized rehabilitation over retribution, illustrating a long-term vision for social healing. Yet victory also generated temptations. Spoils and status can corrode ideals if unchecked, and the leadership had to remind the community that moral standards do not relax with success. Those reminders about humility, restraint, and care for the weak were as important as any strategic counsel in the months after Badr. The setback at Uhud was a painful corrective. When the Muslim force initially gained the upper hand, a group of archers disobeyed orders and abandoned a strategically vital position to pursue spoils, and the ensuing counterattack turned triumph into a costly lesson in discipline, unity, and the moral hazards of impatience. From this defeat came deep teaching. The Prophet did not scapegoat the entire community, but used the moment to stress accountability, the limits of personal ambition in a collective cause, and the need to reconcile, even with dissenters whose loyalties were wavering. It was a reminder that leadership must repair social fractures as carefully as it must defend against external threats. The emotional cost was high. Families mourned, warriors were lost, and the community wrestled with grief. Yet the response also showed resilience. Prayers, communal care for the bereaved, and renewed emphasis on training and discipline helped the society heal and prepare for future trials. And the episode deepened the ethical conversation about sacrifice, obedience, and the responsibilities of followers and leaders alike. When a large confederation of tribes besieged Medina in what became known as the Battle of the Trench, the community faced a crisis of survival that called not for head-on combat, but for creative defense. A Persian convert suggested digging a trench around vulnerable approaches, a tactic unfamiliar in Arabian warfare, and the willingness to adopt this innovation exemplified the community's adaptive intelligence, openness to counsel, and refusal to be bound by tradition when new circumstances demanded novelty. The trench turned the siege into a war of attrition, and rather than glorifying violence, the narrative highlights endurance, cold nights, rationing, and the spiritual work of keeping morale alive through prayer and mutual support. As tensions eased, diplomatic rifts, internal divisions were exposed and addressed, and the siege ultimately failed because of sustained communal will, shrewd negotiation, and the limits of coalition politics among the besiegers. That episode also underscored an abiding principle in the Prophet's strategy. Military action was a last resort. Defensive measures were to be proportionate, and even in conflict, there should be rules that protect innocence and that seek an end to bloodshed when possible. Throughout these crises, the Prophet exercised a rare combination of moral clarity and political sagacity. He sent envoys to potential allies, wrote measured letters to regional leaders, inviting them to peace and to consider the new monotheistic message, and he negotiated truces when they served the longer-term health of the nascent polity. These diplomatic moves were not signs of weakness, but of a leader who saw power as the ability to hold people together, not merely to dominate them. Internally, he cultivated mechanisms for justice, arbitration councils, ethical guidelines for warfare, and protections for orphans and the poor, so that the community's survival would not come at the cost of its principles. This insistence on institutional integrity helped the society withstand shocks that would have toppled groups built only around charismatic leadership without law. Personal stories during these years bring the large themes to life. The gentle humility of a companion who shared his last morsel with a starving neighbor. The bravery of someone who risked clan retribution to shelter a persecuted believer. The tears of families who buried their dead and then met each morning to recite verses that turned grief into resolve. These intimate moments stitched the moral fabric that sustained the polity when armies gathered at its borders. The Prophet's own demeanor, steadfast prayer, temperate speech, and generous care for opponents who were open to reconciliation taught followers that victory required more than military skill. It required moral repair, inclusion of the marginalized, and an institutional architecture that could translate spiritual ideals into everyday practices like fair markets, school instruction, and collective welfare. By the time peace treaties were negotiated and the community's borders stabilized, the experiments of Medina, the constitution, the mosque as civic center, the blending of worship and governance, and the ethical rules for conflict had matured into a blueprint for how a religious movement could become a just polity without sacrificing compassion. These chapters of migration, siege, battle, and negotiation show that the rise of Islam was not a sudden conquest, but a patient, morally informed political project, one that combined spiritual conviction with legal innovation, that valued human dignity even amid conflict, and that recognized the hard truth that building a just society demands both courage on the field and patience at the hearth. As you consider these moments, imagine the ordinary decisions that made them possible: a neighbor sharing bread, a young man standing guard in the night, a letter written to a distant ruler pleading for peace. And remember that history is often turned by such small acts, joined to stubborn faith and thoughtful strategy. The night journey and ascension, known as Isra and Mi'raj, arrived like a sudden luminous interruption in a life already full of toil and reflection, and its story has gripped believers for centuries because it compresses the intimate and the cosmic into a single, unforgettable night. One evening, as tradition recounts, he was taken from the sacred mosque in Mecca, transported to the farthest mosque in Jerusalem, where earlier prophets had stood, and from there he ascended through the heavens, meeting patriarchs and prophets whose names anchor the moral memory of the monotheistic tradition. The journey links him to a long line of spiritual witnesses and situates Islam within a larger sacred history. What makes this episode so powerful is not just the miraculous motion from earth to heaven, but the practical gift it brought to the community. The 5 daily prayers, a rhythm that would structure individual life and communal time, that would convert private devotion into collective discipline and tie every believer's day to a repeated moment of humility before God. Imagine the young community of Medina learning to pause 5 times a day, to leave the marketplace and the field and gather in small circles to face a sacred orientation of prayer. That rhythm created a shared heartbeat for social life, a repeated reminder that spiritual allegiance shapes daily behavior and priorities. The Isra and Mi'raj also affirmed the Prophet's spiritual authority by placing him in a line with previous messengers, which soothed some doubts among friends and gave the community a transcendent narrative to hold on to when political pressures mounted, and it moved private conviction into public practice in a way that was both consoling and organizing. Back in Medina, the consolidation of communal practices turned spirituality into institutions that cared for the poor, protected the vulnerable, and built a public ethic around dignity. Zakat, the mandated almsgiving, was systematized not as charity alone, but as a mechanism for redistributing wealth to stabilize society so that orphans, widows, travelers, and the indigent would not be left to fend for themselves. The mosque functioned as more than a spiritual center. It was a courthouse, a council chamber, a school, and a place of refuge. And through it the Prophet taught that worship and civic duty are inseparable. The person who prays must also be the person who feeds the hungry and settles disputes justly. His guidance on social justice extended into numerous practical measures. Orphans were given protection and property rights, widows were supported and respected, and the dignity of women was insisted upon in a culture where they had often been marginalized. These reforms were not abstract legalities, but lived commitments, enforced in small acts, like who inherited what, how testimonies were taken, and how public funds were spent. He emphasized that piety is tested by how you treat kin and neighbor, and that moral seriousness required concrete habits, visiting the sick, standing with the weak, fair dealings in commerce, so that religion became a lived ethic, shaping daily life down to the smallest interaction. Education, too, was urged. The Prophet called for reflection upon creation, for learning across borders, and for teaching that would carry revelations into practical wisdom. Even as manuscripts were few, oral transmission and memorization created a culture where knowledge and piety reinforced one another in schools that would later become the world's great centers of learning. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah is a study in strategic patience. Outwardly, it seemed to many of his followers like a concession, a postponement of a hoped-for triumph. But beneath the immediate disappointment lay a masterclass in long-term thinking. By agreeing to a truce with Quraysh terms that included deferring a planned pilgrimage, he bought the community a decade of relative peace, and that peace allowed ideas to spread without the disruptions of constant warfare. Converts came not by the sword, but by witnessing a moral steadiness and engaging in dialogues that might have been impossible during perpetual conflict. The treaty revealed an important leadership lesson. Sometimes a pause, a politically painful compromise, and a refusal to escalate can produce the conditions where a movement's influence grows deeper and more durable than short-lived military victories. In similar fashion, the campaign at Khaybar combined military engagement with negotiated settlements that protected non-Muslims' rights in exchange for security arrangements and tribute. The result was a pattern in which conquest, where it occurred, was often accompanied by contracts and protections intended to manage pluralism rather than to annihilate local communities. Khaybar's settlements also demonstrated administrative savvy. Fertile lands were put to productive use, agreements over revenue were established, and the community learned to integrate new populations through a mix of fairness and firm governance, so that the moral claims of the faith were matched by the administrative competence of the polity. When the Prophet entered Mecca in 630 CE, the scene was remarkable for the restraint and magnanimity he showed. Rather than enacting revenge after years of persecution, he issued general amnesty for many of his former enemies, a move that shocked contemporaries and has echoed through history for its moral boldness. The Kaaba, then filled with idols and a center of polytheistic practice tied to Mecca's economy, was cleansed of those images and restored as a sanctuary dedicated to monotheism. But what stands out is that the change was implemented with an emphasis on spiritual reform rather than vengeful purging. Many who had fought against him were spared, allowed to convert or to retain their lives under the new order, which allowed the community to consolidate without creating a cycle of blood feuds. This moment crystallized a recurring theme in his leadership. Mercy was not weakness, but an instrument of social transformation, because integration by forgiveness often achieved more lasting peace than punitive retribution could. The return to Mecca also allowed him to provide clarifications on pilgrimage rites, to model humility even at the center of religious life, and to show that the spiritual center of Arabia could be reimagined around a message of justice and singular devotion rather than economic exploitation and tribal privilege. The farewell pilgrimage that followed was a culmination and a teaching moment rolled into one. Thousands gathered, and he used the occasion to recapitulate vital ethical commitments: equality before God, the dignity and rights of women, the prohibition of exploitation and tribal arrogance, and the finality of his prophetic message that called for adherence not only to ritual but to moral behavior in everyday life. His sermons emphasized that no noble birth made one superior, and that the measure of a person is their piety and ethical conduct. He enjoined fair treatment of servants and slaves, urged the protection of women's rights, and summarized social teachings that would continue to guide communities long after his death. In the wake of these events, alliances were formalized, former foes integrated into the growing polity, and administrative practices, registries, delegation of local authority, and systems of zakat distribution were strengthened so that rapid territorial expansion in the decades after his death would rest on institutional foundations rather than solely on charismatic leadership. Throughout all these episodes, the Prophet balanced firmness with clemency. He exercised military leadership when necessary, but not for conquest's sake alone. Each action was weighed against moral aims, protecting lives, securing worship, and building structures that could sustain justice beyond his own lifetime. The pattern that emerges is instructive for any leader. Ethical ends require strategic means, and the success of a movement is as much about how it treats the defeated as how it wins, about the institutions it builds to administer justice, and about the moral imagination that can turn victory into a durable peace rather than a prelude to further violence. These chapters of spiritual vision and political wisdom, of ascension and prescribed prayer, of treaties that chose time over temper, of mercies that converted foes into citizens, and of institutional work that tied ritual to social welfare, reveal a leader who thought in generations rather than in immediate gains. The lessons are practical: rhythm your life with humility, transform worship into social responsibility, choose patience strategically, and prefer reconciliation when possible, because the moral authority that invites genuine adherence is won by justice and compassion more than by force. As you reflect on these moments, consider the ways in which ritual, law, and mercy were woven together to create a resilient community. The prayer that centers the day, the treaty that buys time for growth, the pardon that breaks cycles of revenge, and the institutions that turn private acts of piety into public goods, these are the building blocks of a society that sought to live its highest ideals. His character was the capital of his message. Every moral teaching he gave was anchored in a life of modesty, generosity, and constant humility, and the people around him, companions, neighbors, and even distant observers, recalled not lectures, but small habitual acts that made ethics visible and believable. He slept on simple bedding and accepted little from luxury, not to perform poverty as a virtue, but to show that dignity does not depend on display. The cloth he wore, the food he ate, the way he shared what little he had with those in need became a practical sermon, teaching that leadership is lived in the quiet economy of everyday choices rather than in pomp. Generosity in his life was not occasional philanthropy, but a steady discipline. He would give away goods even when his household had little, invite guests regardless of their status, and often go hungry so a visitor could eat first, demonstrating that giving is an extension of one's identity, not a transactional favor. Those who sought his company discovered that he listened more than he spoke, that his answers were brief and precise, and that his patience in dispute and affection in counsel turned converts into lifelong followers. People were drawn less by rhetoric and more by the credibility of his conduct, and that credibility became the moral capital of a growing community. Speech for him was sacred because it could heal or harm, and he taught that restraint, truthfulness, and avoidance of slander are the mortar of social life. Gossip corrodes trust, boastfulness damages souls, and yet a single kind word can restore hope. So he urged people to weigh words as carefully as coins, to make promises they could keep, and to forgive quickly when offenses were small, and to seek restorative justice when harms were great. His famous equation of action and intention, reminding followers that deeds are judged by their inner aims, shifted moral attention inward without dismissing outward responsibility. A prayer performed for show loses its merit, yet the inward revival of sincerity must be reflected in outward acts of kindness, fairness in business, and public care for the vulnerable. He modeled how to balance fear and hope in faith, encouraging humility before God's majesty, while fostering active compassion, and his sayings about mercy, moderation, and prioritizing the needy became touchstones for a lived ethic that refused extremes and celebrated proportion. His reforms for social dignity were concrete and practical. He insisted on fair treatment of those with less power, servants, laborers, women, and the dispossessed, and developed norms that curtailed exploitation, required honest measurement in trade, and protected the weak from being trampled by the strong. Women in his community were given rights and recognitions that changed social practice. Inheritance rules, consent in marriage, and expectations of respectful treatment were pressed into law and into everyday behavior, so that dignity became not an abstract idea, but a set of enforceable obligations. He counseled husbands to treat wives kindly, to share household burdens, and to see family life as a moral workshop where virtues like patience, mercy, and prudence are practiced and taught to the next generation. His household was a living classroom where compassion was not only preached but practiced in tending children, resolving disputes, and honoring mutual responsibilities. Equally, he placed limits on revenge and blood feud culture, insisting that compensation, arbitration, and reconciliation should replace endless cycles of retaliation, thereby establishing civic norms that made community repair possible and humane. Work and labor were dignified under his view. He praised honest laborers and merchants who traded fairly. He criticized those who exploited others for profit, and he taught that no work is low if it serves the common good. The dignity of manual work featured in countless anecdotes where he commended a carpenter, a farmer, or a craftsman for contributing to the welfare of society, thereby breaking down an elite spirit divide between spiritual life and ordinary labor. He emphasized mutual rights between employers and employees, timely payment, fair expectations, and humane treatment, and this ethic built trust in economic exchange so that markets could be places of cooperation rather than exploitation, which in turn stabilized families and neighborhoods. In commercial life, he forbade deceit, encouraged clear contracts, and praised those who balanced profit with fairness. This translated into commercial norms where measurement, honesty, and social responsibility were as much part of trade as price and supply. Education and reflection were pillars of his moral vision. Even in an era when formal schooling was limited, he urged learning for every believer, prized literacy, and made reflection on creation and history a route to humility and wonder. Knowledge, for him, was not trivia but a tool for moral and spiritual formation. Seekers were to learn not for vanity but to serve others, to interpret revelation responsibly, and to build institutions that preserved learning, study circles, memorization of scripture, and mentorship that passed wisdom generation to generation. The result was a culture that honored scholars, teachers, and wise elders while warning against arrogance in scholarship. The ideal student combined erudition with humility, using insight to heal ignorance rather than to assert superiority. This emphasis on learning birthed a pattern where faith and reason converse. Scripture invites reflection, and reflection deepens compassion. In short, intellect and heart were to be partners in moral life. His sayings about neighbors, the poor, and even animals show an expansive moral imagination. A neighbor's dignity extends beyond formal ties to practical obligations of care. The poor are not anonymous statistics, but people deserving hospitality and empathy. Beasts of burden are to be treated kindly, because all creation bears signs of the Creator. Such teachings expanded the circle of moral concern beyond kin and tribe, to include strangers, animals, and the environment in which people live. In everyday life, this translated into small yet transformative practices: sharing food, forgiving petty slights, caring for the elderly, and preserving trust by returning lost property, rituals of civility that made neighborhoods safer and hearts softer. The moral ecology he fostered was not static. It required constant work, institutional support, and personal vigilance, because virtue is fragile and needs both habit and community to flourish. Leadership in his model was servant leadership. He consulted companions, welcomed dissenting voices, admitted mistakes when appropriate, and chose managers and deputies for competence rather than mere loyalty. This ethic of consultation, shura, and accountability prevented governance from becoming arbitrary and modeled a political morality where power is a trust, not a prize. He rewarded merit and corrected error with an eye to restoring relationships rather than humiliating opponents. And by treating advisors and critics with dignity, he created a politics where correction was an opportunity for reform and not merely for vindication. This approach taught the community to value institutions, courts, councils, and norms over charismatic authority alone, so that when he was gone, the movement could survive by rules and by the moral habits he instilled. Stories of his humility and humor make him approachable across centuries. He accepted gifts, but rarely hoarded them. He laughed gently without ridicule, and he entered laughter and grief with equal compassion. Companions recall that he would sometimes take the simplest seat in a gathering and never demand honors that others expected him to claim. In moments of crisis, he combined decisive action with tenderness. In moments of triumph, he reminded people of their shared frailty. In moments of temptation, he returned to prayer and counsel. These patterns made his moral authority credible because it was tested in both private sorrow and public triumph. His life, therefore, becomes a manual for moral formation. Practice humility, institutionalize justice, teach gently, reward competence, protect the weak, and keep learning, because ethics without structure often erodes, and institutions without moral habit become machinery. As you reflect on his character, ask not merely what he forbade, but what he cultivated. What habits did he encourage to make goodness habitual rather than exceptional? The answer lies in daily rituals: prayer that centers the spirit, charity that loosens greed, hospitality that dissolves fear, and study that disciplines the mind. Habits that together create a moral muscle memory, enabling a community to act nobly under pressure. His example teaches that the transformation of society begins not only with laws or sermons, but with the slow accumulation of small acts done with great love. It is in keeping promises, returning trust, feeding a neighbor, and forgiving an insult that the moral world he envisioned takes shape, one modest act at a time. The community he led was never a one-man show. It was forged through relationships, councils, and countless small acts of cooperation that multiplied into durable institutions. And central to that social chemistry were the companions whose lives intertwined with his in ways that shaped both immediate decisions and centuries of memory. He listened to them, debated with them, laughed with them, and at times rebuked them, but always treated them as partners in a shared task rather than as mere followers. and that pattern of mutual respect created a political culture where consultation, shura, and accountability mattered as much as prophetic guidance. Among these companions were figures who later played outsized roles in the community's history. Abu Bakr, whose steadfast loyalty and quiet counsel provided early political ballast. Umar, whose fierce sense of justice and administrative rigor helped shape the community's public order. Uthman, who brought wealth and a conciliatory temperament that aided expansion. And Ali, whose devotion and courage symbolized both kinship and principled opposition. When crises arose, each of them was close to the Prophet in life and consequential in how the community remembered him afterward. Their relationships with him were not theatrical endorsements but living mentorships. He advised them on governance, probity, family life, and spiritual discipline, and in turn, they tested his advice in messy reality, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, but always carrying forward lessons learned in those intimate exchanges. Women in his circle were not sidelines, but transmitters of knowledge, moral authority, and social memory. Aisha, in particular, emerges as a luminous figure whose sharp intellect, prodigious memory, and willingness to teach made her one of the primary channels through which later generations received legal and ethical guidance. Her recollections of domestic life, ritual details, and the Prophet's explanations of complex situations gave the early community a rich archive, and her role demonstrates that early Islamic moral formation was shaped as much in kitchens and private gatherings as in formal courts and councils. His marriages, often misunderstood in later commentaries, served social functions in a tribal society. They linked families, provided support for widows, and created bonds across fractured groups, and these unions frequently positioned women as social diplomats, educators, and custodians of communal memory, rather than merely private companions. Fatima and her descendants, the Ahl al-Bayt, occupied a special moral and spiritual place in the community's imagination, their household narratives preserving tenderness, sacrifice, and an ethic of care that many later Muslims leaned on as a model of sanctified family life. The way he chose associates and delegates modeled a meritocratic impulse unusual for the time. Competence, trustworthiness, and piety often mattered more than lineage when it came to appointing governors, judges, or envoys. And this practice helped create administrative structures that could govern newly integrated territories without collapsing into nepotism. He listened to criticism and sometimes changed course. When advisors erred, he corrected them gently but firmly, always aiming to restore social harmony rather than to humiliate. And these management habits taught the community that authority is a trust towards which one must behave with humility and responsibility. The Prophet's modes of conflict resolution, favoring testimony, arbitration, restitution, and reconciliation, reduced cycles of vendetta and built norms for civic adjudication. His encouragement of oath-taking, witness testimony, and mediation clinics within the mosque made dispute resolution an ordinary practice rather than a spectacle of revenge. This moderation did not signal weakness but a structural approach: build rules, train leaders, and embed moral habits so that the community's cohesion outlived charismatic personalities and could be handed to future generations as functioning law and practice. His household was itself a teaching institution. Daily routines, disagreements, reconciliations, and leisure all became occasions for moral instruction, and by living modestly and treating family members with kindness, he made domestic ethics public lessons. Guests were honored, children were disciplined with love, servants were treated with fairness, and the Prophet's own children and wives often acted as exemplars and interlocutors in ethical debates, reminding the community that the moral project begins in the home and extends outward to markets, courts, and battlefields. In subtle but powerful ways, he elevated the social position of knight, those often marginalized orphans, widows, and debtors by insisting on concrete protections and by personally intervening to ensure fair treatment. Such interventions were not occasional humanitarian gestures, but systematic efforts to redesign social incentives so that compassion had teeth in law and practice. The community learned to see social welfare not as charity alone, but as civic insurance. Zakat and voluntary alms were predictable mechanisms designed to prevent destitution rather than episodic acts of mercy, and this administrative imagination is one of his enduring legacies. Economics under his guidance carried moral weight. He forbade deceitful weights and measures, condemned usury that preyed on the vulnerable, and praised partnerships and fair contracts that distributed risk and benefit equitably. These prescriptions were practical because they smoothed daily transactions, reduced fraud, and protected families from ruin, and they also instantiated a theological point that economic life must be governed by justice. Merchants who traded honestly were celebrated, laborers who worked with care were respected, and the dignity of work, whether in the fields, in workshops, or in caravan trade, was consistently affirmed, dissolving the ancient prejudice that spiritual life and manual work were incompatible. In this sense, his social program integrated spiritual claims with civic prudence. Prayer and fasting were personal disciplines, while marketplace ethics and welfare systems were public embodiments of those disciplines, turning private piety into communal good. Education and the preservation of memory were collective responsibilities. He encouraged vigorously. Companions memorized revelations, debated meanings, and taught one another across neighborhoods, and this oral culture established a methodology for preserving scripture and prophecy that later codifiers would systematize. He praised literacy, urged people to seek knowledge even as far as foreign lands, and treated teachers and scholars with esteem, creating an intellectual climate where learning was not elite hobbyism, but a public virtue tied to moral formation. The ethical training of judges, the mentoring of young leaders, and the use of the mosque as a school all reinforced the idea that a just polity requires educated citizens and conscientious officials, and these priorities paid dividends as the community navigated governance challenges and legal controversies in its expansion. Personal anecdotes from companions illustrate the relational ethics he modeled. A man who quietly returned a lost item and preferred anonymity was praised. A woman who stood up for her rights in a public forum received the Prophet's attentive ear. A neighbor's small kindness was elevated as nearly equivalent to grand acts of worship. These stories compress moral theory into memorable living examples that communities can imitate without needing complex doctrinal manuals. He used parables, proverbs, and short sayings to teach compact moral heuristics that could be remembered on a caravan or repeated in a courtyard, and those pedagogical choices made his teachings portable, practical, and resilient across diverse cultures and centuries. The net effect was a moral grammar, short phrases and vivid examples that guided conduct, institutional rules that enforced standards, and personal mentorship that transmitted values from person to person so that morality became communal habit rather than brittle law. Even in the painful moments when companions disagreed, when a grave error required correction, or when loyalties were tested, his response often sought restoration. He favored restitution, mediation, and reintegration where possible, and he recognized that governance involves not only deterrence, but also repair. This restorative impulse shaped how justice was practiced, how revolts were quelled, and how the community dealt with internal dissent. By modeling reintegration over permanent exclusion, he preserved social capital and prevented fractures that could have shattered the polity. Leadership, in his example, meant holding people accountable, but also holding open pathways back into community life, because a society that expels its troubled members loses more than it gains. What it loses is the chance to reform and redeem. The companions' proximity to him made them living repositories of moral nuance. They preserved his words, modeled his practices, and carried forward institutions built in his name, but they also mediated tension between fidelity to his memory and the practical necessities of governance after his death. Their debates, councils, and sometimes painful disagreements were part of a transition from charismatic leadership to institutional order, and the fact that the community survived those transitions speaks to the depth of the moral and legal habits he had instilled. In short, his relationship with companions and family was not mere biography. It was the engine of social formation that turned revelation into law, charisma into institutions, and individual virtue into civic structures. An enduring lesson that movements which survive are those that cultivate both personal virtue and robust public practices. The Quran was revealed to him gradually over roughly 23 years, a slow and careful schooling that responded to the needs, crises, questions, and moral development of a growing community rather than arriving all at once like a single polished book. And that gradual unfolding meant the scripture was always embedded in life, in disputes, in marriages, in battles, in grief, and in celebration, so that revelation and reality informed each other in constant conversation. Early revelations addressed the deepest metaphysical truths, the oneness of God, the reality of the afterlife, the moral accountability of the person. But many verses also solved immediate social problems. They set rules for inheritance, clarified the ethics of commerce, regulated wartime conduct, and shaped family law. And because of this context-sensitive delivery, the Quran functioned as both a spiritual guide and a practical constitution for communal life. Those first audiences did not read from a bound codex. They heard, memorized, and recited, and this oral culture created a living transmission where recitation itself became an act of devotion and communal memory, with whole households gathering to repeat verses until they became lodged in both hearts and tongues. The Prophet himself would recite the revelations to companions who memorized them, and scribes would write down surahs and portions on available materials, palm leaves, parchment, shoulder blades, so that the preserved text was both an oral performance and a patchwork of written fragments, each reinforcing the other. Because people memorized large portions, sometimes the entire text, a social architecture formed in which the human mind served as an archive, capable of preserving scripture across distances and crises in ways that purely written cultures sometimes could not. And this oral technique shaped the way communities engaged the sacred text for generations. After his death, the community faced the question of how to preserve what had been revealed in a stable, unified form, and the answer came through careful leadership and collaboration among the companions who had been closest to him. The task of compiling the revelations into a single written mushaf, a codex, was undertaken earnestly during the caliphate of Abu Bakr at the urging of those who feared loss, especially after many memorizers were killed in battle, and Zayd ibn Thabit, a young scribe who had worked with the Prophet, led the effort to collect verified fragments, cross-check oral recitations, and produce a reliable manuscript. This initial compilation prioritized accuracy. Only verses that could be attested by multiple trustworthy witnesses or were written in the Prophet's own hand were accepted into the standard copy, and where differences existed, the committee deferred to consensus and direct chains of transmission, thus balancing written evidence with the living testimony of memory. A later standardization under Caliph Uthman addressed emerging regional variations in recitation by producing a handful of authoritative copies from the collected mushaf, and sending them to major cities, while ordering variant materials to be destroyed to prevent confusion. This painful but deliberate decision aimed to safeguard unity of recitation and practice across a rapidly expanding polity. The result was a remarkably uniform text that has remained remarkably stable across centuries of manuscript transmission, and even today the Quranic text, used by the vast majority of Muslims worldwide, traces back to those early editorial decisions that prioritized both fidelity and communal coherence. Parallel to the preservation of the Quran was the preservation of the Prophet's sayings and practices, the Sunnah, which later scholars compiled into what we now call Hadith literature, a massive corpus that records his words, actions, and tacit approvals across thousands of individual reports. Unlike the Quran, which achieved textual unity relatively early, Hadith transmission unfolded over centuries and required the emergence of a sophisticated science to authenticate reports, because oral traditions can multiply and mutate, and because the stakes, legal rulings, social norms, devotional practices were high. Early collectors developed rigorous tools to evaluate narrators. They traced isnad's chains of transmission, examined the moral character and memory of transmitters, compared the content or matan of reports with established principles, and rejected what failed tests of continuity or plausibility. These methodological innovations represented an early form of critical historiography that sought to preserve truth in a sea of testimony. Key transmitters such as Aisha, Ibn Abbas, Anas ibn Malik, and many others became living libraries, whose memories and integrity were subject to scrutiny and praise across regions, and their testimony formed the backbone of Sunni and Shia collections in different proportions as communal memories diverged on particular issues. Women played an outsized role in this testimony. Aisha, in particular, narrated thousands of reports about domestic life, ritual detail, and legal nuance, and her proximity to the Prophet made her a central authority on matters ranging from prayer mechanics to ethical response in crisis, demonstrating that the preservation of prophetic practice was not a male monopoly, but a communal enterprise enriched by female memory. The relationship between Quran and Sunnah is complex and dynamic. The Quran supplies the foundational message and broad legal principles, while the Sunnah often supplies the specific applications and clarifications that enable those principles to be lived. When a Quranic verse articulates a duty, a hadith will often show how that duty was practiced in daily life, and together they form the primary sources for jurisprudence, ethics, and devotional life in Islam. Jurists and exegetes over the centuries developed methods to reconcile apparent tensions between reports, to prioritize stronger chains of narration, and to use reasoned analogy where texts were silent, thus building a legal tradition that was at once textually grounded and adaptively interpretive. Exegesis, tafsir, became a rich field where linguistics, context, and the Prophet's example were woven together to explain verses whose literal meaning might be opaque to later readers, and early exegetes emphasized the importance of knowing the circumstance behind a revelation, asbab al-nusul, to avoid anachronistic or literalist readings that missed the ethical thrust of the text. This hermeneutical conversation produced a diversity of legal schools, interpretive styles, and devotional practices across regions, differences that historians often describe as pluralism rather than as mere division, and that pluralism allowed the universal message to be embodied in diverse cultures while retaining a core of shared commitments. Preserving scripture and practice also involved pedagogy. Teachers, mosque, study circles, and traveling scholars became the engines of continuity, carrying copies of the text, chains of narration, and memorization techniques into new towns and provinces where minds were trained to recite, to debate, and to apply the sources to local circumstances. Centers of learning such as Medina, Kufa, Basra, and later Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba cultivated specialized knowledge. Quranic recitation sciences, tajweed, hadith, criticism, jurisprudence, and the principles of legal reasoning, and those institutions professionalized the transmission of religious knowledge so that new generations could inherit both text and method. Manuscripts multiplied, commentaries stacked up, and oral certification, ijaza systems, developed so that scholarship could be accredited and responsibly transmitted, creating networks of accountability that reinforced both fidelity to the sources and the capacity for creative application. Scholars debated vigorously, but also translated that debate into pedagogy and legal opinions that addressed marriage, commerce, warfare, slavery, and social welfare, thereby converting foundational texts into living policies that governed everyday life across continents. The preservation project was not without challenges and controversies. Debates arose about variant readings, about the relative authority of certain hadith collections, and about how to weigh legal precedent against textual silence, and at times, political rivalries colored the acceptance or rejection of narrations, reminding later readers that human institutions mediate the preservation of sacred texts and are therefore fallible. Nonetheless, the overall achievement was striking. A scripture and an associated body of practice were transmitted with a level of fidelity and critical apparatus that allowed a religious civilization to build law, literature, theology, and science on top of them, while also leaving room for interpretive plurality and reform. The impact of this preservation extends into modern times. Translations proliferated, academic scholarship applied historical critical methods, and contemporary believers engaged with digital tools and critical editions to re-examine context, language, and application, while often reaffirming the core conviction that the Quran and the Prophet's example remain primary guides. For the listener today, then, the story of how text and tradition were preserved is not a dry archival tale, but a story about memory, trust, method, and human responsibility. It asks us how communities remember rightly, how they build institutions of verification, and how they guard sacred teachings from distortion while allowing those teachings to speak into new lives and new challenges. When you read a verse or hear a hadith, you are touching centuries of attentive care, the late-night reciters, the careful scribes, the debating jurists, the traveling teachers, and the household memories that refuse to forget, and understanding that lineage helps us see why many Muslims treat scripture with both reverence and reason, because preservation was not passive, but an active ethical labor that demanded honesty, cross-checking, and communal accountability. This history also invites modern learners to consider their role in transmission, whether through careful study, through teaching others, or through supporting institutions that prioritize integrity. Each generation inherits the responsibility to protect what was entrusted to it while translating its spirit faithfully into new contexts. He fell ill in the final days of his life, surrounded by those who loved him and those who feared what the future might hold. And in that quiet decline, the community watched a leader who had guided wars and treaties now teach with his presence the meaning of gentleness in the face of mortality. He passed away in Medina in 632 CE, a date that marks not an end to a message, but the beginning of a new and difficult chapter for the people he left behind, because the revelation they had received together now had to be preserved, interpreted, and lived without the bodily presence that had embodied it for 23 years. His burial took place in the simple chamber adjoining the mosque, where he had prayed and taught what had been Aisha's room, and that ordinary resting place, humble and unadorned, became for generations a place of deep reverence, memory, and pilgrimage, a physical anchor for hearts seeking to remain connected to a life that taught humility even in triumph. The immediate aftermath of his passing was a moment of profound sorrow and confusion. Grief swept through families and tribes, debates about leadership surfaced urgently, and the community faced the practical tasks of governance, preservation of texts and teachings, and the spiritual labor of continuing to embody a living message without its central living teacher. Succession was not a foregone conclusion, and the choices made in the weeks and years after his death shaped political trajectories as well as devotional life. Close companions gathered, argued, and ultimately selected leaders whose authority would rest partially on their proximity to him and partially on the moral and administrative systems he had instituted. The first caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, each carried distinct strengths and weaknesses, and their tenures produced lessons about how a religious movement navigates the transition to statehood, how to balance fidelity to founding principles with the messy realities of empire, how to institutionalize charity and justice, and how to adjudicate disputes when sacred memory and political necessity collide. These early episodes included painful conflicts, debates over interpretation, and even civil strife, but they also produced administrative innovations, postal networks, judicial appointments, and tax systems for zakat that took abstract principles and made them operational across a rapidly expanding territory, demonstrating that a religious community must also learn the hard arts of governance. Through triumph and tragedy, the companions sought to keep the revelation central, to honor his memory, and to extend his ethical commitments into law and public life, even as political actors sometimes colored outcomes with ambition or fear, reminding later readers that institutions depend on the virtue of those who steward them. His death prompted an extraordinary surge of textual and institutional work. The Quran was compiled into a single, widely accepted codex. Hadiths were gathered and critiqued, and the community invested in schools, judges, and scholars to ensure that the teachings could be taught faithfully across distances and generations. What might superficially look like a neat handoff revelation to community, leader to deputies, was in practice a messy, human process that required checking memories, corroborating accounts, and translating lived example into laws that could be applied by strangers a continent away. This translation work produced a rich intellectual tradition of jurisprudence, exegesis, theology, and ethics that would feed not only religious life, but also law, philosophy, science, and literature in diverse societies. The centuries that followed his death saw rapid expansion of Muslim-led polities across the Levant, Persia, North Africa, and beyond. But expansion was accompanied by a remarkable cultural efflorescence. Schools of law, hospitals, libraries, and trade networks grew in part because the prophetic model insisted on knowledge, welfare, and justice as cornerstones of civilized life. Thus, his final exit from the world paradoxically intensified the labor of preservation and the creative adaptation of his teachings to new contexts, a dynamic that kept the movement intellectually alive even as it institutionalized. Memory played a decisive role in shaping his legacy. Companions and family members recounted anecdotes, legal rulings, and personal sayings that became the raw material for later scholars. These memories were carefully debated, authenticated, and sometimes contested, but the effort to preserve faithful accounts demonstrates how communities anchor themselves in narrative to teach, to inspire, and to correct course when needed. The preservation task introduced sophisticated methods of authentication, chains of transmission, cross-examination of witnesses, and comparative analysis that were early attempts at historiography and source criticism, and their application shows a communal seriousness about truth and a recognition that the authority of memory can be both precious and fragile. Over time, different interpretive schools emerged. each reading the Quran and the Prophet's example through lenses shaped by regional custom, linguistic nuance, and political experience. And this plurality produced a dynamic religious civilization where unity of core beliefs coexisted with diversity in law, liturgy, and social norms. That very diversity today testifies to a living tradition capable of negotiating difference while clinging to shared essentials like worship, charity, and moral accountability. Beyond institutions and texts, countless ordinary acts across centuries testify to the living impact of his life. Hospitals built in his spirit cared for the sick, schools nurtured curious minds, charity networks alleviated suffering, and travelers carried his ethical teachings into marketplaces, courts, and homes, turning kitchen tables and guild halls into sites of moral practice. Poets and philosophers invoked prophetic ethics to argue for justice. Jurists translated his teachings into statutes that regulated commerce and family life. And ordinary people invoked his sayings in moments of temptation and grief, showing that his influence was not confined to elite discourse, but permeated the rhythms of communal living. The symbolism of his life, simplicity in noon triumph, mercy in conquest, patience in hardship, became templates for leaders and citizens who sought a blend of moral gravity and practical wisdom that could sustain societies through expansion and crisis alike. In this way, his death did not close a book, but opened a long project, translating a prophetic example into institutions, habits, and narratives that would survive political cycles and cultural shifts. Modern readers often ask how a single life can continue to shape millions across centuries and continents, and one answer lies in the interaction between text, memory, and practice. The Quran and the Hadith function as authoritative anchors, but it is the social practices, prayer, fasting, charity, pilgrimage, dispute resolution, and family law that embed those anchors into daily life and thus reproduce them across time. Teaching institutions, legal schools, and spiritual communities have acted as transmission belts, translating core teachings into local idioms and practical rules so that an Arabian message could feel at home in Andalusian courts, Persian cities, Malay trading ports, and modern metropolises. Each new context asked fresh questions and, through interpretation, found ways to let the foundational principles speak meaningfully. This adaptability has been both a strength and a challenge. It allowed the faith to spread and to civilize diverse societies, but also invited debates about which aspects are essential and which are cultural accretions, debates that continue to animate contemporary scholarship, reform movements, and everyday practice. The alive and arguing nature of that legacy suggests that honoring him means both preserving fidelity to core teachings and engaging thoughtfully with changing realities, an intellectual and spiritual responsibility passed down from generation to generation. Finally, the moral core of his life, the insistence on mercy, justice, humility, and care for the vulnerable, remains a continuing test for those who claim his legacy. Institutions may falter, rulers may err, and societies may drift, but the challenge he left is perennial and personal. Can individuals and communities shape laws, economies, and cultures that protect dignity, prioritize the weak, and bind people together in mutual obligation? Whether one approaches his life as a believer seeking spiritual guidance, a historian tracing institutional development, or a citizen curious about ethical leadership, the final chapters of his life and the way the community responded offer lessons about stewardship. Preserve carefully, adapt wisely, govern justly, and never let power eclipse mercy. As you hold his story in mind, consider what it asks of us now: to build communities that honor truth, to create institutions that defend dignity, and to practice small acts of care that, stitched together, can remake societies, continuing a project that began in a single life and has carried on through countless hands and hearts ever since.